My name is Kate Berry. I work on the Global Hotlines team at Polaris Project, and today we want to talk a little bit about emerging trends in technology, data, and combating human trafficking. Polaris Project is an anti-trafficking organization based in the United States. We're named after the North Star Polaris that guided slaves towards freedom along the U.S. Underground Railroad. And since our founding in 2002, we've been very focused on a comprehensive and community-based approach to combating all forms of human trafficking, both inside the United States and around the world. Today's presentation, like I said, is going to talk about this emerging trend we've been seeing in our frontline work on human trafficking. That is traffickers' use of technology and ways for the anti-trafficking community to leverage technology to better respond to the crime of trafficking and support survivors. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what those trends are. What are we seeing in our work with survivors of trafficking and in our work running the U.S. National Hotline for Human Trafficking. We're going to talk about the needs that we see in the anti-trafficking movement, some of the missing links that we've seen in our hotline work. We're going to talk about hotlines as a way to harness and leverage that technology, and we'll talk about some emerging programs that we're working on here at Polaris Project and that we're looking for international collaboration on. So the first piece we wanted to talk about today were these emerging trends that we've seen in human trafficking, and that's traffickers' use of technology. Trafficking is a fluid, it's a dynamic crime, and traffickers are very good at adopting new technologies and adapting them to facilitate their work and increase their profits. So a couple examples of what we've seen here on the U.S. National Hotline for Human Trafficking and in our work with survivors of trafficking. We've seen them using technology for recruitment. So one major area where we see this being used is in social media, social networks. Traffickers use systems like Salesforce, MySpace, other social networking platforms to recruit victims into their crime. We see job postings posted online on places like Craigslist and other online advertisement sites. These are often false advertisements for jobs, the sorts of modeling, waitressing, promised jobs that then turn into trafficking situations. Traffickers are using the internet to facilitate that sort of recruitment. We've also seen YouTube actually and cell phones being used to recruit potential victims as well. The next area where traffickers are using technology is to advertise. So to advertise for commercial sex, for example, or for the labor services of their victims. Backpage in the U.S. is a major site for sex ads, and Craigslist, of course, is another site where advertisement takes place, and there are dozens and dozens of others around the globe. We'll talk a little bit more specifically about Backpage later in the presentation, but those sites, particularly that are targeted towards sex ads, are often being used to advertise victims of trafficking. And then, of course, the webcam use is a significant area for advertisement as well, so advertising sexual services via webcam. Traffickers are also using technology to monitor and control their victims. So often they're monitoring cell phone usage. With GPS trackers built into cell phones, they can see where their victims go at any time and control their movement that way. They also, some have used video cameras in the home to keep track of where their victims are going, what services they're providing, and where they are at all times. Of course, they also often threaten to post images online. So with the way that we can so easily transmit images via the internet, traffickers will threaten to post graphic or compromising images of victims online to keep them in the situation. And of course, with online networking, it's very easy for traffickers to find the family and friends of victims and use that as a mechanism to threaten them further, threaten to blackmail, shame, that kind of thing. Another area where we're seeing traffickers use technology to control their victims is through credit. Traffickers will sometimes ruin credit in retaliation for a victim who's left their situation, or they will use bad credit as a reason to keep victims in the situation. You don't have any credit, you can't live without me and the money that I'm giving you. Facilitating payment. So with systems like apps for smartphones, traffickers can actually swipe credit cards from, say, buyers of commercial sex on their cell phones, making it so much easier for them to receive payment for the services that they are exploiting their victims for. We've also seen an interesting potential trend in the use of virtual currency. So virtual currency being untraceable often in the exchange of currency is yet another way that traffickers can use modern technology to facilitate their crime. It becomes easier and less traceable for them to accept money from those buyers of commercial sex, for example, or people using the labor of their victims. We also see traffickers using burn phones. So what that means is a prepaid cell phone that they're using for a short period of time to collect payment from buyers, to have buyers as a way for buyers to get in touch with them and order commercial sexual services, and then they can throw away those cell phones so that they can't be traced back to a contract, back to the trafficker. Communication and information sharing. Online communication makes it much easier for controllers to network. So organized crime groups can use these online resources, places like Facebook or MySpace, online posting boards, that kind of thing, to communicate among each other, talk about ways to facilitate their crime, control methods, that sort of thing. We've seen reports of YouTube and Facebook being used for these purposes on our national hotline. And the final way that we're seeing technology being used is through anonymous networks. So anonymized networks permit untraceable and private communications between individuals, the transfer of money, that sort of thing, in a way that can't be traced to an ISP address. These sort of networks have been used in the past to host pornographic content involving minors, and we certainly see ways that they can be used to facilitate illicit crime. So in conclusion, what does all this mean? It means that we are seeing technology intended for really good purposes being used in a negative way to facilitate the crime of trafficking. Traffickers are great at taking the latest technology and saying, how can I use this to my advantage? And unfortunately, as an anti-trafficking movement, we are not quite up to their speed. So we are not as good at adapting the latest technologies. We're a little bit behind the curve. And that's one of the things that Polaris Project is focused on and wants to work towards. In short, modern slavery requires a modern response. We can and we should leverage technology to protect and serve survivors, to foster collaboration among the many players in the anti-trafficking movement, and ultimately to prevent trafficking from occurring in the first place. I want to talk a little bit about a way that we have seen that preventing trafficking and using technology can work really well, and that's through the U.S. National Hotline. Since 2007, Polaris Project has operated the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. That's the 24/7 U.S. National Hotline for human trafficking. In that time, we've received over 90,000 calls from every state in the United States and over 104 countries worldwide. We're currently receiving over 20,000 calls a year. These calls range from people wanting to learn more about trafficking, to people reporting a trafficking situation, to victims reaching out for crisis support. So it's an all-services hotline available all day, every day. And through this hotline, we have seen clearly that well-supported, well-resourced hotlines are an essential part of this modern response. We're talking about 21st century hotlines. What does 21st century hotline mean? A 21st century hotline is accessible. We call them multimodal hotlines. There are many different access points for any sort of victim or caller to reach out to the hotline. This isn't the antiquated call center that you might think of when you hear the word hotline. It's really a dynamic, high-functioning communication and resource center. So here at the National Human Trafficking Resource Center in the United States, callers can reach us by phone, a traditional phone number, and that number is 888-373-7888. They can reach us by email at nhtrc@polarisproject.org. We recently added SMS or text messaging capabilities to our hotline. So we can be reached via text message, again, 24/7. And that number is 233-733, or it spells out to the short code BE FREE. We also receive online reports. So through our website, callers can fill out an online form and submit a report to us that way. We've also seen a number of hotlines around the world using online chat functions to reach out to victims in real time. Our hotline doesn't use that yet, but we've seen that as an incredibly successful model for individuals who need help to reach out to the hotline if they're not comfortable making a phone call. What each of these different methods of communication means is that any type of caller, no matter their comfort level, can get in touch with the hotline at any time. If they're able to make a phone call and our hotline number is toll-free from within the United States, they can give us a call that way. If, say, they're unable to talk on the phone, but they do have possession of a cell phone, they can send a quick SMS message. And we're always making sure that victims who communicate with us are safe. In that way, we're not calling people back if we don't have permission to get in touch with them. Our first concern is the victim's safety. But we want to make sure there are as many ways for them to reach out to us as possible. 21st century hotlines are also have advanced language capabilities. So at our hotline here, we use a teleinterpreting service. So we can serve survivors of trafficking in over 180 languages. They call us and tell us what language they want to speak, or we're able to figure that out through the words that they're using on the phone. And within a minute, up to 2 minutes at the very most, we have an interpreter on the line with us who is bound by confidentiality and can help us communicate with that victim. And that is, of course, in addition to the language services that our call specialists on the hotline already have. 21st century hotlines also rely on extensive resources. So this map that you see here shows our emergency response protocols in the United States. So for every area in the United States, our hotline has mapped out a response protocol for an emergency situation. You'll see in some places they're on the statewide level in the United States. In some places they're actually on the city level. So that if a victim calls and needs immediate crisis support, we know who to call any time of the day or night. Of course, a lot of our calls aren't those crisis situations, but they are survivors who need help accessing services. To that end, we operate a database of over 3,000 service providers in the United States. We can find the best possible resource for any victim in any sort of situation. We're able to search the database on a number of criteria. So if you are in New York City looking for services for a male survivor of sex trafficking who is an adult, we can go through our database and find the best resource for that survivor to get him the help that he needs. The other part that's very important about this resource building system is it's not just about amassing the database itself, but we found that in the process of collecting this referral structure, building what we refer to as the root structure of the United States to support victims of trafficking, we're able to identify where resources don't exist and then divert some of our energy to helping build those resources, to equip law enforcement with the tools they need to serve survivors, to help direct funding or other support to nonprofit organizations that can serve survivors, or share some of the expertise we've learned over the years about, for example, shelter services for survivors. So the very act of having a hotline that ties all of these pieces together can actually help create the root structure system that will support a survivor in the first place. The other piece that's important about hotlines is they can also serve as knowledge or information hubs for the area that they cover. So on our hotline here, we call it a resource center because we're providing all sorts of technical assistance and other information resources to any sort of caller. So we have students who call our hotline and ask to learn more about trafficking, and we're able to direct them to resources. A lot of times people who want to volunteer will call and say, I'm interested in getting involved in my community. Where can I help support anti-trafficking work? And we're able to direct them to the resources best able to assist them. We're able to engage in safety planning with victims before they enter a dangerous situation. We can talk about ways to keep themselves safe. So that's another important piece of hotlines, is that resource provision to help support the anti-trafficking community more broadly in a given area. Another important function of hotlines is collecting data. This heat map shows the density of calls received by our hotline in 2012. This only shows our calls from the US, but you can see over 20,000 calls there, often more dense in the highly populated areas of the U.S., but we're receiving reports from all 50 states. We've recently started to think about how we can use that data. On any given call, we collect up to 170 data points, information about the victim, about the controller, about the type of trafficking that's taking place. We also track the actions that we take as a hotline. So if we provide referrals to a service provider, we'll be tracking that. So we know if this caller calls back, we understand their situation, we understand what resources we've already directed them to, and help make as seamless a transition of services to that victim as possible. This data not only helps us better support individual victims, but it also helps us look at trends in trafficking in the U.S. With this information, we can see where is more labor trafficking taking place, where are the areas where pimp-controlled sex trafficking is happening, what truck stops see a lot of sex trafficking taking place. And we're just starting to explore the data capacities of our hotline. So to that end, I want to talk a little bit about how we envision using this data and how we see it as part of the anti-trafficking movement's technological response to trafficking through a very quick case study. So I mentioned Backpage.com previously on this session. Backpage, like I said, is a major website for sex ads in the United States, and we often see victims of trafficking being advertised on there for sexual services. This web that you see shows some of our cases of trafficking, some of the cases reported to our hotline of Backpage ads and potential trafficking situations. So the web represents the ads themselves, any controllers that were mentioned, any victims that were referenced, and all of the calls we received about those cases. We've received a lot of these cases. This web only shows a few. If we were to drill down onto two of those ads, we would see this. One ad is a Backpage ad in Memphis, Tennessee. The other is in Miami, Florida. Both were reported to our hotline, but at different times. They both became individual cases or situations of trafficking on our hotline. In one case, in the Memphis ad, we had information about a pimp named Ray. We also have the phone number listed in the ad. In the Miami ad, we don't have any pimp reference, but we do have the phone number listed in the ad. When we look at all of our data around Backpage, we're able to see these two ads in two different cities, two different victims, have the same phone number. Same phone number, same controller. This information is incredibly valuable in helping us find the victims referenced in the situation and also to crack down on the traffickers. So we're starting to think, what if we were able to do this kind of analysis across the globe? This is where our idea of strategic intervention comes in. If we're looking at data around human trafficking in a meaningful way, we have 4 different ways that we can use that. So one is for prevention. If we're able to see, for example, that minors in the foster care system are more likely to end up in human trafficking situations, we can identify them as a vulnerable population and build in supports to help them ensure that they don't end up in a trafficking situation. We can also identify recruitment tactics and methods. So if we see that Facebook is being used a lot, for example, we can start to ask questions about how can we engage that community to better ensure that predators aren't preying on their victims using Facebook. There's an intervention piece as well. If we can identify how trafficking is happening, we can better come in at the critical point to stop it. So for example, what borders are particularly porous? What visas are being misused? So for example, a domestic worker comes into the U.S. under a particular type of visa and then is being exploited for domestic servitude. What visas are those? Where are there loopholes in policy? These questions can help us not only identify individual situations of trafficking and squash those situations, but also to make broader systemic changes. We can increase the risk for traffickers. As we gather intelligence on existing networks, on existing operations, businesses they're using as fronts, other traffickers that they're networking with across the country, we can make trafficking more risky and intervene in that way. And finally, we can look at support structures. So who are the middlemen? What systems are being used? What technologies are being used? And how can we better adapt them to ensure that they're not being used for exploitation? Of course, responding to human trafficking and really realizing eradication or the end of trafficking requires more of a global approach. And so although Polaris Project has worked primarily on human trafficking within the U.S. for the last 10 years, we've been hearing about cases of trafficking involving all nationalities and happening all around the world. This map here shows some of the foreign national victims of trafficking referenced on our hotline. These victims come from places like Mexico, China, the Philippines, Russia, Vietnam. I could go on, dozens and dozens of countries around the world, people who end up in the U.S. and then are exploited while they're here, victims of sex trafficking and labor trafficking, men, women, adults, and minors. We've also received reports of international cases on our hotline. So although our hotline has been primarily advertised to a U.S. audience, we're often receiving calls from overseas. Those are usually situations where the caller is concerned about a friend, a family member, or themselves has looked up online resources or somehow come across our phone number and see that we are a hotline that exists to help survivors. And so oftentimes, survivors and victims, oftentimes people are calling us because there is no hotline that they can find in their area or in their region. There may not be any U.S. connection in the situation that they're reporting, but they need help, and we're a 24/7 hotline available to help them. To us, this really underscores an important need for hotlines around the world, and that's where our global program comes in. To date, we've identified around 80 hotlines around the world. This map shows some of them and shows the 2012 call volume. Because trafficking happens everywhere, we have to be prepared to respond everywhere, and we want to expand our experience with the national hotline globally. Every country and region can benefit from a hotline, and as you see on this map, there are many areas that don't have hotline coverage. We also want to support all different types of hotlines. Many different models of hotlines around the world can be successful, and I'll talk a little bit in a minute about what we mean by that. So it's from this desire to work internationally that our Global Hotlines program was born. Just within the last year, we've started to talk more and more at Polaris about how we can engage in the global community and how we can share what we've learned with other hotlines around the world. We're engaged right now in a 4-step program. The first piece is mapping anti-trafficking organizations and hotlines around the world. We're trying to understand where anti-trafficking resources exist for victims and, importantly, where they don't exist. We're then connecting with the hotlines that we've identified. We want to understand how they function, what successes they've had, what challenges they face. Our hotline here in the U.S. works very well in a U.S. context, but we recognize that it's not applicable everywhere in the world. So we want to understand in what contexts hotlines have been successful and the different models that exist. We're then prepared to offer training and technical assistance. We can help new hotlines start up from scratch, or we can help existing hotlines enhance their services. Although we're focused on human trafficking specific hotlines, we're also looking at ways to engage related issue hotlines. So other hotlines like child welfare hotlines, domestic violence hotlines, labor rights hotlines, and talking about ways in which they can embrace a human trafficking lens in their work. This technical assistance also includes the future publication of a hotlines toolkit, a 10-module toolkit that can be used in whole or in part to support the work of human trafficking hotlines. And the final point that we're working on is growing this human trafficking hotline network, a collaborative network of human trafficking hotlines around the world. We've talked a lot about the importance of individual national hotlines, but it isn't enough just to have hotlines operating in isolation. Eradication, truly ending human trafficking, requires international collaboration. If we think about why this might be, we first consider the needs of victims and survivors. Victims may need cross-border services. As we know, trafficking doesn't require crossing a border, but that often does happen. There are language questions. What if you are a Cambodian victim in Thailand and the Thai hotline doesn't speak your language? How are you going to explain your situation and get help? In the United States, we often get calls from other countries, and it's hard to know who to best send the case to. So if we hear of a case in Canada, for example, who are we going to connect that to? If a survivor wants to return home, how do we ensure that that repatriation happens smoothly and that they're receiving all the services they need? And there's also the question of protecting future trafficking victims or identifying traffickers. For example, a Nigerian woman who is recruited to work in Italy. Let's say she meets a recruiter who gives her offer of a job as a waitress. She accepts the job, but when she arrives in Italy, she ends up working in commercial sex as a forced prostitute. We need a mechanism for that case to be reported back to Nigeria so that that recruiter isn't allowed to prey on other vulnerable individuals. And oftentimes those are conversations that aren't happening. There's a final question about data. Hotlines are collecting rich data every day, but how much more useful would it be if, say, hotlines in the United States, Canada, and Mexico all shared their data together to identify trends or vulnerable populations? Or what if a hotline in the Philippines and a hotline in Japan were able to communicate about the experience of Filipino domestic workers? We could learn so much more about this crime, where it's happening, how it's happening, and who is vulnerable. Generally speaking, on-the-ground collaboration in the anti-trafficking field is limited, but hotlines are a way to make that collaboration happen. That's one of the things that we're focusing on with this Global Hotlines program. The Global Human Trafficking Hotline Network is the structure that we're putting in place to help facilitate some of that international collaboration. We just launched this partnership in April 2012 with 3 founding members. La Strada Czech Republic, which has operated a hotline for many years out of Prague. Liberty Asia, which is preparing to launch a network of hotlines in Southeast Asia. And Polaris Project, the operator of the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline. We envision adding many more members to this network over the years to better facilitate this international collaboration. This network has several purposes. The first is peer-to-peer engagement. Hotlines can learn so much from each other about what works, what doesn't work, tips for handling crisis cases, best practices for operating a 24-hour hotline and supporting hotline staff. There's so much we can learn from each other, and the network is a structured way to do that. This is also an arena to facilitate case coordination. Like I mentioned before, victims often cross borders, and can be a need to communicate back to the country of origin or through the transit countries and the destination country. And if a hotline is aware of hotlines in every country along that stage, we can better ensure that the case is reported where it needs to be and that the survivor receives the services they need. We're talking about a global victim safety net. So if we're able to build a global database of human trafficking organizations, any hotline worldwide would be able to take a call from anywhere and then provide the best possible referrals to that survivor, ensuring that no victim falls through the cracks and that any victim can reach a hotline with just one phone call, one text message, one email. We're also talking about system support. In many places, hotlines aren't using the modern technology that they could to better enhance their services. So some of the pieces that we're working on are databases to track cases, track survivors, ensure that all the players are up to date on what's going on with a particular survivor situation. And those systems also have profound implications for data collection. Some hotlines we've heard of worldwide aren't able to collect their data, or if they do collect data, they're not collecting it in a system that allows them to easily analyze it to pull out trends or key pieces of information. If hotlines are operating on that kind of modern technological system, then they're able to share data. They're able to take the information that they're learning on their hotline, pull out any personally identifiable information, so we're not putting victims at risk, but then share the sort of top-line trends in the aggregate with other hotlines around the world. From there, we're able to do trend analysis. So with this global data, with all of these pieces coming together, we can identify where and when trafficking occurs. What time of year, for example, does agricultural trafficking happen more often? Or what paths do particular trafficking rings take through Europe? We can strategically intervene and help victims. We can identify where the trafficking is taking place, and with that information, we can better assist the victims when they need it. We can respond faster across borders. Like I said, a lot of international collaboration isn't happening yet, so if we have the players at the same table working together, we can better assist when trafficking cases cross borders. And finally, we can change the equation for traffickers. Trafficking flourishes because it's a high-profit, low-risk activity. With this strategic information, if we're able to really understand where the trafficking is taking place and how, we can change that equation to make it low profit and high risk. Of course, hotlines aren't the only way that we can leverage leverage technology as an anti-trafficking community. There are ways for lots of other groups to contribute data to this project as well. International organizations already collect a lot of really important information about vulnerable populations, about trafficking, about migration. There are lots of scholars doing academic work right now on trafficking. The list goes on and on about the people that could be a part of this technological, data-driven response to trafficking. So in summary, what are the key takeaways from this? Traffickers use technology to their advantage. They are much better than the anti-trafficking movement at adapting the latest technologies to make their crime as high profit as possible. And we need to better respond to them. We need a modern response to modern slavery, and that requires a true adoption of technology and data. And hotlines are one way to do that. We can provide better, seamless support to victims. We can better collaborate across borders. We can better collect and analyze our data to bring strategic intervention. When we take information from around the globe and really understand how we can make this harder for traffickers to the point that it's no longer profitable, that's the point where eradication happens. And we believe here at Polaris Project that through hotlines, help can be just one signal away. When 6 billion people around the world have mobile phones, we want to ensure that they can reach help at any point, at any time. If you're interested in learning more about the work that we're doing and our data-driven approach to combating human trafficking, I encourage you to visit our website, polarisproject.org. You can also contact us by email. Like I said, we are just in the beginning stages of this program, but we're preparing to be able to offer technical assistance to the anti-trafficking community. At the end of this presentation, we'll also have a poll question. We want to understand what hotlines you're aware of in your community, whether they're human trafficking hotlines or they're hotlines that work on child protection or domestic violence. We really feel that everyone in the anti-trafficking community has a role to play with hotlines, and we want to learn from you. So please be in touch, let us know what you think, and we look forward to working together. Thank you.
We think of trafficking as being similar to modern-day slavery. Trafficking is incredibly diverse. It's extremely fluid. Traffickers are often moving quicker than the response is moving, and they are using technology to facilitate their crime.
The International Labor Organization estimates that over 20 million people are enslaved today.
When you are looking at people who are effectively enslaved, every single morning an individual is getting up and they might be contemplating suicide. They might be thinking that they can't possibly physically make it through another day.
This is a global problem. It's happening in countries all around the world, and it's being under-recognized by society.
We've taken over 70,000 calls on the U.S. National Hotline, and we've identified more than 8,000 victims.
We would get calls from survivors. There'd be a girl crouched in a hotel room while her pimp was asleep, with the water running in the bathroom, whispering into the phone. We begin to tell her about resources in the area. We can map out where she is. We can immediately create a response.
A lot of hotlines are operating in isolation, and they are learning really valuable data every single day, but there's no effort to really connect the dots.
When cases cross borders or when victims move around, we're responding to the immediate situation, but we're not taking what we learn and applying that to actually end human trafficking before cases begin.
Imagine a world where we have the data at our fingertips to know where trafficking is happening and how and where to respond to it. We're launching into this collaboration with Polaris and Lustrada and Liberty Asia. We're beginning to experiment with ways to share data.
Where are different networks operating globally? When do they operate? Which vulnerable populations are they targeting?
We have seen incredibly diverse trends coming out of the data that we've been able to collect.
Pimps and sex traffickers are advertising to truckers and forcing women and girls out into prostitution. We're getting hundreds of calls in from truckers saying, this is where human trafficking is happening. I just encountered it. And we're able to identify certain hotspots, certain risk areas, certain patterns. We can replicate that process dozens and dozens of times over for other types of trafficking, And not only can we do it here in the United States, but other hotlines can begin to do something similar in other countries around the world.
By taking that information and being able to really understand how we can make this harder for traffickers to the point that it's no longer profitable, that's the point where eradication happens.